They say the ocean teaches you patience. You learn to listen for the change in the wind before you feel it. To smell rain in the seams of your jacket long before it appears. You learn that tides come in generous and leave without a word. Places collect those lessons. So do people. I didn't set out to become the kind of woman who waded through other people's weather. Who held steady while their storms blew hot and cold. It happened the way frost creeps over the window in January, so slowly you swear it's not moving until the pattern is everywhere. That morning, I believed I was made of the better parts of this town, salt and work and quiet. And then I learned what it means to be told you're not welcome in a place you built with your own 2 hands. My name is Elise Morin. I work nights on the respiratory ward in the regional hospital up the coast. When most people press their faces into pillows and dream of kinder lives, I am under their breaths, counting beats, adjusting oxygen flow, waiting with them as machines tick off minutes they cannot see. A half-hour drive from there, where the harbor narrows and the gulls grip the pier rails like white clothespins, sits Greywater. It is a modest town built around a scallop plant and a hockey rink. Though to hear the locals tell it, the rink came first and then they all had to live somewhere. I was married here once. And as happens sometimes with love and with weather, the forecast changed. Colin and I separated. It wasn't the worst way to end a marriage. There are gentler failures than the kind that flatten houses. We simply lost our footing. We kept our boy, Jonah, steady between us. The morning of the meeting, I left the hospital as the sky softened from slate to milk. The night shift makes the sun feel like a rumor. I stepped out to the parking lot, took in a lungful of air so cold my teeth sang, and drove home on roads that remembered the last snow. The fields were stubbled with leftover cornstalks and, in places, the plows had thrown up windrows that looked like sleeping animals, none of that romantic or dramatic. Just what the road does in winter. My car heater has a sweet spot if you set it to the notch just before it rattles. I kept it there and listened to the news murmur about a budget debate in Halifax and a weather advisory that would bring a wet chill by nightfall. I pulled into our driveway. A narrow ribbon of compacted gravel my ex-mother-in-law called a goat path, back when she still pretended to joke with me. The house is a square 2-story with a small porch where I keep a coil of blue rope and a rusted bucket of clothespins. It faces the harbor like a polite woman waiting for her ride, not prim. Just patient. Inside, the kitchen was dark. I put on the kettle and set out 2 bowls for cereal. One with more than the other. It's a habit from years of stretching paychecks. Give the child the larger serving and then make a good show of preferring toast. The house settled around me as the kettle came up to a tremble. Jonah shuffled in wearing his team hoodie and the smile he saves for mornings when there's practice after school. He is 12, with a goalie's concentration and a way of standing still that fools people into thinking he doesn't feel things as sharply as other kids. He does. He always has. He sat, sniffed the milk to make sure it hadn't crossed that fine line between close enough and no. Mother. Then gave me a look that said I had chosen well. We ate in companionable silence. Lunches were packed the night before, mine out of necessity, his out of habit, and when he zipped his backpack, the sound cut a small, clean line through the quiet. I'll make it to the meeting, I told him as I handed him his gloves. Might be a few minutes late. Save me a seat if it fills up. Who else would want to sit in the front row of civic pride, he said, twinkling in a way he gets from no one in particular. Don't rush. It's not pride. It's housekeeping. Same thing, just with better lighting. He kissed my cheek and left in a burst of cold. I stood looking at the door he'd closed and let the house be still again. I'm not one for posting quotes on the fridge. But if I were, I might have framed that line, better lighting. Greywater spent a lot of energy lighting up certain names. And somehow my own had fallen into the shadows exactly where people found it most convenient. After tidying up, I lay down for an hour. Night shift sleep is not a real sleep, it's an uneasy truce. The clock dragged me up at 10. And by then the day had firmed into a fragile blue. I took one of my nicer sweaters from the chair by the dresser. The soft gray one I reserve for official gatherings. And pulled my hair back. I looked like every other midlife woman in this town on a day we handle other people's business. That has always comforted me. I do my best work when I look like one more shoulder at the wheel. On my way to the community center, I did my usual circuit. I stopped at the rink and stood in the gallery a moment. Above the scrape and sigh of skates. It smelled of rubber mats and sharpened blades and the faint sweetness of the Zamboni's propane. Our rink is not one of those gleaming arenas you see in cities. The boards are nicked with years of collisions. The ceiling shows the skeleton of its beams. But here, kids learned to keep their knees soft and their eyes up. I've always believed there are a few places a community should hold sacred: the library, the clinic, the rink. We had 2 out of 3. The clinic folded 10 years ago when the doctor retired. And the next one found better money on the mainland. The rink we kept alive because the town decided it would. Which is just another way of saying a few people decided and the rest didn't fight them. At the office window, I dropped an envelope. Inside was a receipt for the new netting. Signed and dated. And a note asking them to keep the purchase anonymous. The board had wanted to plan a small plaque for me after the last fundraiser. And I had told them I'd prefer the kids have clean air to shoot pucks through instead. The woman at the desk nodded. She knew the routine. "You'll be at the meeting?" she asked. "Wouldn't miss it." "Good," she said. "We need sensible." I don't know that I am sensible. But I do keep lists. I walked the 2 blocks to the bank and picked up a printout I'd requested of the guarantor letter I signed 18 months ago. Back then, the plant's delivery truck had blown a transmission. They needed a bridge for a line of credit. The bank manager had been cautious in the way of men taught to be. I had sat upright and explained that I was prepared to guarantee a portion to keep the company afloat through the contract period. It was not something I did lightly. I had known the numbers. Known the people. I had believed that the community had a house to keep and this was part of sweeping the floors. I was still married then. Barely. And it seemed the proper thing. I did not tie the guarantee to my marriage, I tied it to the work. Sometimes I wonder if that was my mistake. From there I stopped at the fish plant. The loading dock smelled like it always does: bleach, ice, and a workday that wouldn't quit. A young man I didn't know had a pallet jack halfway across the threshold. And I stood aside until he finished. Because there is an order to all workplaces whether people admit it or not. Inside, I checked the invoice board where they post outgoing deliveries and circled a date that looked wrong. An error. Easy enough to fix. I made a note to call later when someone had time. Colin came around the corner, caught sight of me, and brightened the way he always does with people even when he doesn't know what to say next. "You're up early," he said. "Late," I corrected. "Night shift." He nodded the way men nod when confronted with the parts of other people's lives they cannot imagine. "You'll be at the meeting?" "Yes." He looked down at the scuffed toes of his boots. "Ma thinks it's going to be a good day for the family," he said, then glanced up, apologetic. He does that, casts his mother's voice like a line and reels it back without quite touching it. "She's been planning the unveiling. You know how she gets." "I do." Judith gets thorough in a way that leaves no space for oxygen. "It's a committee," I said. "It should be a good day for the town." "Right," he said. He shifted. Jonah's been good lately. Focused. He is always good, I said, more sharply than I meant. He flinched and then smiled anyway. He is not a bad man. Just one who never learned how to stand between two people without leaning into the wind of the strongest one. At noon, I drove to the community center. A cluster of sedans and half-tons filled the lot. Inside, the air was the familiar mix of coffee, dry markers, and the lemon cleaner the janitor likes. Chairs were arranged with more ambition than our town typically warrants. A row of flags borrowed from the school. A banner for the Fall Fair Committee across the back wall. A projector warming up to show slides of smiling children on the ice. I know those children. I have taped their knees, bought their raffle tickets, and sat beside their parents on bleachers so cold our legs went numb. I am not a savior. I am simply a hand that was there when it was needed. I took a seat near the front. A few people lifted their chins in greeting. Others looked down at their phones. You learn to read these rooms. The faces of the committee made a neat line across the table. Gary. Who runs the hardware store and knows more about lumber than he does about balance sheets? Maureen. A teacher who keeps minutes with a precision that makes the rest of us more honest, and Judith, who arranged the papers before her as if she were setting the table for a superior she intends to impress. She opened the meeting with the brisk efficiency she saves for public moments. It is a gift and a weapon. Welcome, everyone. We have a lot to celebrate today, she announced. As you know, the rink has been a beacon for Greywater. We're finally ready to unveil the list of lifetime patrons who have kept it alive through lean years and fat. I felt a small shift in the room. The word, we, always does that. It is a very heavy pronoun. Judith went through the agenda. Letting small business tidy itself away, bake sale tallies, volunteer shifts for the fairground cleanup. Then she clicked her pen against her notes. A signal as clear as any gavel. Item 7, she said. Patron recognition. The projector threw up the first slide, a white background. Navy lettering. Names in a column with tasteful spacing. The Lawrents were there, of course. The bank. A man who moved away to Alberta and sent money back. A logging company that used to sponsor a team before their trucks went north for good. The room murmured appreciatively. She clicked to the next slide. More names. Some familiar. Some newer. She was working through the list with the rhythm of someone who has rehearsed privately and now wants the room to catch up to her tempo. On the fourth slide, on a line where my eyes knew my name would be because I had learned to expect it, and more honestly than I like to admit, because a small stubborn part of me needed it, I found nothing. The space where it should have been had been given to a donor whose generosity had been a photo op with a novelty check. A man who once told the kids to call him Uncle, and then missed 3 playoff games in a row. I did not stand. I did not clear my throat. I tried to catch Maureen's eye. But she was scanning the room for questions and found none. Judith looked out at the audience and smiled with all her teeth. Her earrings caught the fluorescence. When no one objected, she kept going. The slide changed to an announcement, an unveiling ceremony to coincide with the opening skate of the Fall Fair in 2 weeks' time. A hand went up near the back. It was Louise, the nurse from day shift. Is this everyone? She asked. Judith's smile didn't falter. Everyone who fits the board's criteria. She said, we tightened it up this year, needed to be sustainable donors. Consistent involvement. No conflict of interest. Clean and simple. There are phrases that seem innocent until they settle in your bones. Clean and simple. There was nothing clean about the way people keep places alive. It's always messy. Always human. Simple is what you call it when you don't want to explain your math. I raised my hand. And for a moment the room made that sound rooms make when someone unexpected wants the floor, the slight adjusting of bodies. The quieting of coughs. Yes, Elise? Judith said. There was brightness in her tone. A light that flickers when it sees a moth. Could the board share the criteria? I asked. I may not understand how we moved from last year's guidelines. We haven't moved, she said, and then, as if remembering herself, softened it. Well, not in any substantive way. We just clarified our terms. Clarified them how? It would take some time to explain the legalities. She said, we wanted to avoid a situation where someone with an obvious conflict could be seen to influence the allocation of funds. Optics matter. Optics, I repeated, and tasted the strange bitterness of the word. Am I the conflict, Judith? She gave a laugh that invited the room to laugh with her. And a couple of people obliged out of politeness. Oh, Elise, she said, don't be dramatic. But since you brought it up, yes, you have been closely connected to the plant, and to certain committees, and to our family. We felt it would muddy the waters to name you a patron. I am not asking to be named anything, I said. I kept my voice flat. The trick is to let the air carry the words, not the heat. I am asking what we have made this about. Is it money? Time? You mentioned consistency. Consistency is important, she said. People who are here for the long haul. People who represent Greywater well. The room tightened. Words like represent are like loaded traps placed along familiar paths. You step on them and they snap closed over your ankle long before you realize you have wandered off the trail. I thought of nights at the hospital and mornings at the rink. Of receipts and forms. Of phone calls with vendors whose invoices had gone astray. I thought of the bank letter folded in my bag like a sleeping animal. I thought of the day I agreed to guarantee a loan because the plant meant 20 families could keep paying their mortgages. I had not done any of that to represent anyone. I had done it because it needed doing. I swallowed and tried one more time. May I see the criteria in writing? I asked. Judith looked down at her notes. Then back up. Her smile now in the shape you put on when you have decided to be generous with someone you consider foolish. Elise, I'm sure this is uncomfortable. Change often is. The board discussed this at length. The decision is made. We're moving toward a future that reflects our values. Which values are those? Cohesion, she said. Stability. Gratitude. Gratitude. I repeated. The room was now a study in fixed expressions. Some people looked at the floor. A few looked at me as if I had said something impolite. Louise kept her eyes on my face. And I was grateful for that one small kindness. Let's proceed, Judith said. We're on a tight schedule. They moved on to the next item. They discussed the cost of renting extra lights for the ceremony. They asked for volunteers to man the concession. A man offered to call his cousin about a sound system. I sat without moving. I felt the familiar ache in my lower back from lifting patients whose lungs couldn't do the lifting for them. It caught the way a stitch does when you turn too quick. I placed my hands flat on my knees and breathed in through my nose. When your body has learned to keep other people calm, it sometimes forgets to tell your own blood that the house is not on fire. I reminded mine. At the end, when Judith asked if there was any other business, I could have raised my hand again. I could have asked whether the board had considered the ethics of cutting out the work that doesn't photograph well. I could have told a story about a night 2 years ago when the heater failed and I stood with a wrench under the bleachers because the only person who knew the old valve was out of town. But stories, I have learned, do not do their work if the room has already settled on a moral. They collect outside the windows waiting for someone to open a latch. So I stood and gathered my bag. A chair scraped somewhere behind me. I walked to the aisle. Felt the eyes. Some hard and some kind and most just tired. At the door, I paused. There is a way to leave when you have been told you are no longer welcome. You do not aim for drama. You aim for accuracy. You make sure you are not leaving anything of yours behind. The cold met me like a sober friend. On the steps, I put on my gloves and looked out over the parking lot to the harbor beyond. Water pewter under a dishcloth sky. It was a Wednesday. The plant would be loading the afternoon run soon. After 15 years, you know the town's schedule the way you know your own pulse. I thought of the letter in my bag again. Then I took out my phone and drafted a message I had never planned to write. To the bank manager, I would like to revisit the terms of my guarantor letter for Laurent C. products. Please advise on the process for withdrawing my guarantee as per the contract. I left it in drafts. This is the part of the story where people wish for rousing speeches. For righteous thunder, I am not built that way. The ocean does not rage to prove its point. It moves water whether we notice or not. I slid the phone back into my bag and walked to the car. Keys in my hand. When the engine caught, it made a familiar shudder before settling. The heater coughed, then began to warm the air enough to fog the edges of the windshield. I sat a moment longer than made sense and watched my breath fade. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store for milk and apples. Practicalities insist on being met, no matter what speeches have been given in fluorescent rooms. In the produce aisle, I ran into Gary from the hardware store. He shifted his weight, as if unsure whether I was a shelf that would hold. Heavy meeting, he said. They often are when there's cake to plan. I said. He grimaced. Judith doesn't speak for everyone. You know, she speaks loudly for a few. I answered. He nodded, relieved that I had not asked him to define his courage. At the checkout, the clerk asked how my day was. And I said, oh, you know, because I have never believed in handing my heaviness to minimum wage. She taped the milk bag upright and wished me well. Outside, a wet wind had begun. The kind that sneaks under coats and undermines good intentions. At home, I put the groceries away and set a pot of soup to simmer. I have found comfort in making the same meal after hard days, a potato and leek soup so simple it feels like apology. The knife made a steady rhythm on the board. The smell was soft as good wool. I spread a towel over the back of a chair to dry. I picked up a book, put it down, and then laughed at myself. There is a particular ridiculousness to attempting to read when your mind is a room with a projector showing one slide on repeat. At 3:30, the school bus huffed to a stop at the end of the road. Jonah came in with cheeks fresh from the outside and a grin that slipped a little when he saw my face. He doesn't need explanations. He reads air pressure. How'd it go? He asked. As expected, I said, which was true if you have recently learned to expect people to be exactly who they have told you they are. Soup? He nodded. He likes to crack pepper on top until the bowl looks like it's trying to become the night sky. We ate. He told me about a new drill his coach had introduced. About a math quiz he'd probably gotten a question wrong on because he changed his mind at the last second. He asked if he could go to the rink after homework. I said yes and meant it. The thing about people who try to edge you out of the places you've built is that they always forget you know the back doors. After homework, after skates were sharpened and the last of the soup was put in containers for later, I sat with my checkbook at the kitchen table. I took out a stack of envelopes from the drawer and sorted them. Bills due. Donations to renew. Forms to sign. It is an old habit from a time when life would kneel on your neck if you didn't keep every paper in its place. On the left, I placed receipts from acts of kindness I preferred not to mention. On the right, letters I had been meaning to write. In the middle, the bank draft note to myself. which now felt less like a hypothetical and more like a task with a date. I try, when I can, to hold my decisions up to the light. Not to justify, but to be honest. You can do the right thing for the wrong reasons and it will still curdle in your hands. You can do a hard thing and find it has made something softer in a way you did not expect. I thought of the committee and what they had declared in the kind of language polite people use when they have decided truth is too messy to present. I had been told I was not welcome. The truth underneath that was less tidy. I had become inconvenient to a narrative where certain names stood under certain banners and certain faces looked good in pictures. No one said the words. They rarely do, but words don't have to be said to do their work. After dishes. After checking the window twice to make sure the car was locking properly, because sometimes when your mind is busy it forgets things it has always done automatically. I made tea and sat on the small back step. The moon wasn't out yet. The yard was a version of itself that only shows up in winter, flat and honest. Unsoftened by leaves. A few houses over. Someone tapped a snow shovel against concrete. A clean sound. I thought of my father, who used to say that the only thing you can control is whether you are fair when no one is looking. He would have told me to stand up and say my piece. He would have been proud that I did and more proud that I did not shout. He would have reminded me that fairness is not the same as being liked. The phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from Louise blinked on the screen. That was wrong. Coffee tomorrow? I typed a thank you and said yes. There are certain kinds of company you should always accept, those offered by people who were not required to be brave but chose to be anyway. I kept the phone in my hand after that, noticing its weight. It is a small thing. A rectangle that has taught us to talk carelessly. To confuse sending with speaking. I opened my drafts. The message to the bank sat there. A simple paragraph that would be read by a man with ink stains on his fingers. A man who had once told me he admired my steadiness. I thought of what it would mean to withdraw a guarantee. It would not be a revenge in the way the television shows script it, not fireworks. Not scandal. It would be a rebalancing. You remove a brace and you listen carefully to hear which beams groan and which ones hold. I saved the draft again and put the phone in the pocket of my sweater. I went inside and gathered the mending. Jonah's goalie glove had a seam that needed attention where the leather had split. I threaded the needle and worked the thread through. A small exacting task that rewards patience. The glove lay warm in my lap. I find making repairs is the best way I know to tell the truth to a day that didn't say it back. It says, I am still capable of holding things together in the places that matter. When Jonah returned, he threw his gear in the corner where gear goes. The smell of hard work blooming behind him. He made himself a sandwich with the seriousness of an architect. Later, when he was in bed and the house was again the quiet box it turns into after 10. I wrote a list. Not a manifesto. Not a revenge pledge. A plain list in my small, cramped handwriting. 1 item per line. A record of the last 10 years. Insurance premiums paid for someone else when their son broke a wrist on the ice and they couldn't swing the deductible. A delivery of groceries to a family when the father was off work injured and the mother couldn't afford to be proud anymore. The hours logged after shifts. Counting raffle money. The nights spent at tables like the one today. Asking questions in a voice that didn't scare anyone. A tally of the checks I had written when committees couldn't meet their obligations and asked the bank for another week. None of it special. None of it rare. I am not exceptional. I am one of hundreds of women who make a town work by catching what falls. Today, those hands felt used. That is not the same as tired. It is a clearer feeling. With edges. I put the list down and ran my finger along the margin. As if it were a shoreline on a map. It isn't a crime to be unthanked. It isn't even unusual. But there is a line between being modest and being erased. I can stand not being praised. I cannot stand being told that my work dirties the optics. Before bed, I checked on Jonah. He sleeps like a person confident his room will be there when he wakes. I kissed his forehead and turned off the lamp. In my own room, I lay awake a long time, listening to the house do what houses do: settle, breathe, hold. The rain began after midnight, tapping a private song on the roof. I thought of beams and braces, of names on walls and names in drawers. I thought of what might happen if I pulled my support back the way one draws in a bridge before a storm. I thought of whether that would make me unkind or simply exact. When morning finally came, it came like it always does, reluctant and then suddenly here. I brewed coffee and watched the harbor. A boat moved lazy across the water, a dark shape cut from wetter paper. I chose a mug with a chip I always intend to sand down and never do. I opened my phone and read the draft to the bank one more time. Then I closed it. There are decisions you make in a rush and there are decisions you let ripen. When the moment comes, you should recognize your own handwriting on it. I will tell you this much, though, after the meeting. After the kind of silence that buzzes in your ears like old neon. There was a feeling I had not expected. It wasn't rage. I have learned to save that for people who harm children. It was clarity, a clean, unshowy line through a complicated scene. The world had gone from blurry to crisp. The list on my kitchen table looked less like a litany and more like a ledger. The ocean does not care who puts their name on a plaque. It cares if the boats are tied right. It cares if the knots hold. I have been tying knots in this town for a long time. If I have to set down my rope, I will do it deliberately. If I have to teach a lesson in boundaries, it will be gentle and unmistakable. There is a way to leave a room so that the room understands what it had when you were in it. I put on my coat, slid my phone into the pocket along with the gloves I had mended, and stepped back into the day. Somewhere in the distance, the faint blow of a foghorn sounded. It has always comforted me. That low animal note, honest, utilitarian, the sound a place makes to announce itself when visibility is poor. I stood there on the step, coffee warming my hand, and thought about the week ahead, forms to file, a conversation to have at the bank in my patient voice. A visit with Louise where we would smile at the ridiculousness of how people can be and then make plans to keep doing what needs doing anyway. The kind of week that changes a town without a single speech. Behind me, the soup pot waited to be washed. In front of me, the road. Maybe I would walk to the post office, buy stamps, slip a letter into the metal mouth that eats gossip and spits out consequences. Maybe I would make one phone call, and then another, the kind that sound like housekeeping but are really the map of a different future. I did not know exactly how it would feel to pull back my support from people who had mistaken it for something they were owed. I did know what it felt like to stand up on legs that had carried me this far and feel them steady. The rain slowed. The clouds thinned to a skin. Somewhere in the mind's corner, a list shifted from later to today. I picked up my bag, locked the door, and stepped down into the small puddle that had collected at the bottom of the stairs. The cold went through the sole of my boot. I smiled at the sharpness of it. The day had decided, so had I. And if the tide was going out, well, it was only drawing another line in the sand where people could see it. Not dramatic, not cruel, just accurate. The knots would hold where they deserved to. And where they didn't, we would all hear the wood complain. That's the thing about a town like this, if you listen closely. It tells on itself. I walked toward the road with my shoulders square and my hands warm. listing in my head the things I owned that didn't look like things at all. My steadiness. My son's trust. A handful of receipts. A network of women who say little and move much. The wind had shifted from the southwest. I could smell the factory, the harbor, and the faint copper of the community center where they were probably stacking chairs and wrapping cords. If there is a better time than that exact moment to make a clean decision. I don't know it. By the time I reached the mailbox, the words for my letter had set like plaster. Not heated, not hurried, set. I slid the first envelope in, the one with a small donation to the library in the next town over. The one with the clinic that stayed. Then I held the second letter, addressed in crisp block letters to the bank manager. The iron mouth opened. The envelope crossed that threshold with the quietest sound. Barely a whisper. If you had been standing beside me, you might have thought you imagined it. But no, the small sounds are the ones that matter. They mark the places where a person decides to live by her own map. I turned toward home through the thin rain, thinking about the week, about the meeting, about how easily people confuse a smile with an apology. In the end, I suppose, I did what the ocean taught me. I accepted the weather, and I began, gently, to lower the tide. Some debts are tallied in dollars. Others are tallied in minutes you couldn't spare but gave anyway. In rides home at midnight. In errands run when no one was looking because it was faster to do it yourself than to make a fuss. I used to think of those small givings as water poured into a shared barrel, no one's name on it. There when needed. Turns out, if you never mark the level, someone will tell you the barrel was always full on its own. I don't keep score to be thanked. I keep score so I don't lie to myself about what a day cost. After the meeting at the community center, after the polite smiles and the word optics lodged like a fishbone, I woke into a week that had a different weight. The air had the feel it gets before a thaw. When snow goes grainy and sidewalks slick just enough to make you place your feet with care. I had things to place carefully. Not because I wanted to make a scene, but because I wanted to make something right. The morning after I mailed the letter to the bank, I counted quietly through my tasks. The way I count respirations on my ward, steady, factual, no drama. I wrote a list of every commitment with my name on it. Not because I planned to pull out of all of them, but because I needed to see which beams I had been propping up alone. There's a difference between generosity and a load-bearing wall. If you can't tell which you are, someone else will decide for you. I called the rink first. The head of the board that morning was Maureen, the teacher with the tidy minutes. She answered in the clipped way of people on their lunch hour. Pen already poised. I told her I wanted to drop off documentation for the netting and the defibrillator we'd bought 2 winters ago. Receipts and warranty cards and the email chain with the supplier. I offered to file them in the proper binder. She said that would be fine and thanked me in that soft way East Coast women thank each other when both know there's a story under the surface and neither wants to lift its head in public. I hung up and put the folder by the door. After that, I drove to the plant. The road was clear, the ditches rimmed with crust. Men in orange toques shuffled between dock and warehouse. Shoulders rounded against a wind that felt personal. Inside the office, a calendar with a picture of a lighthouse hung crooked. And the receptionist, Alma, who has known me since I brought Jonah in as a baby to show his great-grandfather the machines, looked up with a smile that caught before it reached her eyes. "You here to see Colin?" she asked, already reaching for the phone. "Not today," I said. "I need to look at the accounts receivable board for a minute." "And can you make me a copy of the supplier contract from August?" "If it's handy." Handy is a strong word in this office. She lifted the corner of a stack and produced the folder in a way that told me she had set it aside expecting I would ask. You know where the copier is. I do. I made the copy, checked the board, and found the circled date again, the one that would throw off a payment schedule by 4 days and ripple late fees through 3 lines. I noted it and left a practical message for the bookkeeper. Nothing accusatory, just the kind that prevents a headache next month. Colin's voice floated down the hall, warm. Easy. The way he talks when he is making something complicated sound like a simple favor. I stepped out before we could catch each other. Alma did not stop me, which is its own sort of kindness. On my way back to the car, my phone vibrated. A number I didn't recognize flashed Halifax under it. The bank. I let it ring once more to steady my voice. Then answered. Ms. Moran? This is Grant James from Seacoast Credit. I've received your letter with respect to the guarantor agreement. Yes, I said. I'd like to set a time to talk through the process. We have our paperwork, and there will be a notice period. You'll want to be aware of the implications. I am aware there are implications. I said. That's the point of notifying you properly. He hesitated, then asked the questions bankers who know you ask when they also live in towns like ours. Is there a precipitating financial concern for you? Personally? No, I said. There's a precipitating clarity. I surprised myself with that. It sounded like someone who had slept well and meant their words. He cleared his throat. We can meet Friday morning at 9 if that suits. I'll have the file. We will need your signature in person to trigger the notice. I'll be there, I said. Please send me the draft in advance. I will, he said, and then his voice softened from professional to human. Elise, you've always been steady. This is a significant step. It's a reasonable one, I answered. He said he'd email and we hung up. I sat in my car and let the heater fight its tired way toward warm. Across the lot, a forklift beeped as it reversed. A sound so frequent around the plant that it becomes a kind of town metronome. I thought about how many of our days are paced by other people's machinery. I thought of the word significant and how men sometimes use it when they mean upsetting. I was not upset. I was exact. The next call was to a lawyer. I don't have one on retainer. I am not that sort of person. But I know who to call when contracts get thorny. And everyone in our county knows Patel in the brick building off the main street in Digby. In a past life, he did corporate work in Toronto. Until a death in the family brought him east. And the small town taught him a different scale of problem. He is reserved, precise, and has a way of listening that makes you feel as if he is watching the bones of your sentence. Not the clothes. I explained what I needed to amend my will so that the scholarship funds I'd started wouldn't flow through any committee with potential conflicts, to formalize conditions of transparency, and, if possible, to attach the endowment to an entity that could survive any local board's politics. The kind of housekeeping that keeps other people's hands off work they did not do. Do you want to name the fund? He asked. When I finished. No, I said, or, rather, not in a way that invites speeches. Name it for the work. Greywater Access Fund is fine. If the rink wants to cut a ribbon, they can cut it around children skating. Not me. Understood, he said. Bring me your existing documents. We'll draft the addenda. I'll also prepare a letter to the Fall Fair Committee requesting an independent review of the accounts related to the rink improvements. Not an accusation, just a request for documentation and a third-party eye. Not a witch hunt, I said. Witches aren't real, he said. Balances are. I like him for humor like that. The kind that lets a little air in without making light of anything. We set an appointment for Thursday afternoon. I hung up and felt, for the first time in a while, that my week had a backbone separate from anyone else's plans for me. At the hospital that night, My body moved through its routines with the ease that comes from a decade of small tasks done properly. I hung IV bags, checked blood gases, murmured to a confused man that it was okay to sleep. The machines would not forget to breathe for him just because he did. In the break room, the TV tried to sell us a better mattress. Louise slid a mug of tea across the table and said nothing. Which is the best form of conversation some nights. When she finished her tea, she reached out and squeezed my hand with fingers that smell like sanitizer and soap. Then went back to her floor. Kindness rarely arrives as speeches. It's more often a clean mug and 5 minutes where you are not required to be useful. The day after, the weather kept its promise and the rain stitched fine lines across the windshield as I drove to Patel's office. I parked under a maple that, in summer, drops whirlybirds like notes in a song. The sky was the color of dull coins. Inside, his receptionist had a jar of peppermint on the counter and a puzzle half finished on a side table. She offered me both. I took the candy from my pocket and left the puzzle where it was. It felt wrong to complete someone else's picture before they were ready. Patel's office is spare, 2 chairs, a desk, a shelf with law texts and a potted plant that has fought for its life in winter light. He waved me to a chair and got straight to it. He had already drafted the amendment based on our call and laid out the implications in a neat letter that even a person half sleep deprived could follow. The scholarship funds would bypass local organizations with any family connections to me or the Lawrence. They would be administered by a small foundation in the next county. Audited annually, with reporting posted where anyone could read it. My will would reflect that change. And only a court could undo it. It would cost me something each year, audits always do, but it would buy what I wanted, sunlight. I also drafted the letter to the committee. He said, tapping a second document, it requests, politely but firmly, copies of receipts and bank statements for the last 18 months related to rink improvements. The accounting firm I recommend is in Yarmouth, neutral ground. They'll do a spot check. If everything is clean, the report will say so. If it's not, you will have facts, not rumors. I don't want a scandal. I said, I want adults to behave like adults. Then this is the right path. He said, if anyone asks why, the answer is simple, due diligence. We went through the will line by line. He asked me, gently, if I still wanted Colin named as Jonah's co-guardian in the event of my death. I said yes, because being disappointed by a person doesn't mean you stop seeing their fit in their child's life. The law does not care for hurt feelings, it respects clean lines. When we finished, I signed where he indicated. He slid the stack into a folder and promised to courier copies to the foundation that afternoon. Ms. Moran, he said, as I stood to go. There will be noise. People are attached to their stories. When you move a piece on the board that they thought was glued in place, they mistake it for an attack. Remember your reasons. I will, I said. I wrote them down. Driving back, the rain had turned to a sleet that made a soft fizz on the road. I passed the turnout where people parked to watch the tide and caught a glimpse of the harbor through the trees, a flat pewter sheet with darker bands where wind troubled it. A gull hung in the air over the bridge as if nailed there by some invisible hand. Wings adjusting in micro-movements to stay aloft in a crosswind. I thought about balance and effort that doesn't look like effort. I thought about the sort of work women do to keep families. Committees. Entire towns from going nose down when the air gets rough. I thought about how often that work is called interfering until the moment it's called indispensable. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sleet had settled into a cold rain. Jonah's stick leaned against the porch rail. Tape frayed at the top. I took it inside and fixed the tape while the kettle came up. The simple pleasure of smoothing each loop into place with my thumb. When he came home, he did a double take at the stick and pretended to be surprised by a thing he knew would be done because it has always been done when I see it needs doing. Habit can be its own love language. Practice at 5, he said, shrugging off his backpack. Coach says we're working rebounds. Good, I said. Rebounds tell the truth about the first shot. He grinned at that. Because boys like a sentence that sounds like it belongs on a poster. We ate grilled cheese because the day had the shape of bread and heat. After he started his math, I took the folder to the rink. The woman at the desk, same one who had taken my envelope days earlier, took the receipts and warranties and punched holes in them for the binder marked capital improvements. Her nails were chipped red. She thanked me and asked if I wanted a copy. I said no. I know where things are when I put them there. On my way out, 2 mothers were talking near the trophy case. It's a terrible place for a conversation because sound ricochets off the glass and makes gossip sound like it's being said in a tiled bathroom. I wasn't eavesdropping, the air carried their words without help. I heard she was cut from the patron list because of conflict of interest. One said, "You can't have your hand in everything and still get a plaque." It was time. The other answered, "New blood. The Lawrence have done a lot." I kept walking. There's a special shabby dignity in not turning your head when you know the sentences are about you. Out in the parking lot, I let the wind take the heat out of my face. Then I got into my car, turned on the radio, and let the weather report remind me that roads would be slick after dark and to avoid unnecessary travel. I stared at the word unnecessary and had to laugh. Thursday night on the ward, I got the email from the bank with the draft to withdraw my guarantee. Attached were 2 PDFs, one the form I would sign. The other the clause in the original agreement that set out the notice period. 7 days. I printed the draft and folded it into my pocket. The paper made a rasping sound when I shifted. A physical reminder of a choice looking for a pen. Friday morning. I was in Seacoast Credit a few minutes before 9. Banks smell the same in most small towns, clean carpet. Trapped coffee. The faint zip of static from winter coats. Grant James met me in a glassed-in office with a desk too tall for short people. He has a face built for nodding and a tie his child must have gifted him at Father's Day. A pattern too cheerful for January. He laid out the steps. My withdrawal would trigger a notice to the plant giving them the week to secure an alternative or correct their balance such that the guarantee was no longer needed. If they did not, the line would be frozen. The bank would not call in long-term debt, but they would refuse new drawdowns on the operating credit until the risk profile came back into acceptable range. He said this as if reading morally neutral weather. I appreciated that. I understand, I said. He slid the paper across. And I signed in my small exact hand. He checked the signature against the one in his file. Then stamped the page with a date that somehow made the room warmer for being honest. "Would you like me to notify the company now?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And please send me a copy of whatever you send them. I don't want to hear this through someone at the grocery store." "I'll call and then follow up with an email," he said. I shook his hand and left. In the car, my phone buzzed with a message before I even turned the key. Colin. He doesn't text during work unless something has knocked the pattern of his day out of joint. Bank called. "What's going on?" it read. I stared at the words. I didn't owe him an explanation. We are long past owing each other those. But we have a child and a town and a shared sense of what passes for decency here. So I typed back the truth stripped of heat. I withdrew my guarantee. As is my right. You have 7 days to rebalance or find another guarantor. I let the bank know in writing. This is not a surprise move. It is a boundary. The ellipsis bubble did its nervous dance. He wrote. Erased. Wrote again. You're going to sink us. He sent. No. I typed. Either your numbers hold without me, or they never should have leaned on me this long. A long pause. Then, Ma will be furious. She usually is, I answered. Then put the phone face down on the passenger seat and breathed. It is a strange thing to be accused of cruelty for removing the crutch you were never supposed to be. By noon, word had spread in the way word travels in small places, through cash registers and tailgates and the warm backs of gloves. Louise texted a simple, "You okay?" and I replied, "Yes." At the plant, Colin would be on the phone with the bank. Judith would be in her kitchen rattling pots as if noise were proof of righteousness. And the men on the dock would be doing math with their eyes. Calculating paydays, wondering about the week. I never forget that actions roll downhill onto people who did not create the problem. It's why I chose a notice period. Why I didn't want a sudden stop. Adults can scramble when given clear parameters. It is the secrecy that turns a hiccup into a collapse. That afternoon, I kept my appointment with Patel to review the audit request letter. He had already sent it by courier to the committee's P.O. box. A detail I appreciated because it prevented Judith from claiming she hadn't been told properly. On my way home, my phone rang. Judith. I watched it ring out on speaker in my lap. She called again. I let it go to voicemail. The third time, I answered. There's bravery and then there's foolishness. Choosing when to pick up is often the line between them. Elise, she said, her voice pitched bright, as if she were hosting a radio show about calm. I'm hearing some confusing things. I imagine you are, I said. Is it true you have interfered with the plant's line of credit? During the week of the fall fair? I have adjusted my personal financial exposure, I said, because sometimes it helps to keep the words rubberized so they bounce off where they should. Any business that is properly capitalized should withstand a guarantor exercising her right to withdraw with notice. This is vindictive, she said, punishing the town for a simple change in a list. None of us thought you'd take it this far. This isn't far, I said. This is appropriate. You made a choice about who represents gratitude in this town. I'm making a choice about what I will underwrite. I'm not leaving anyone hungry. I'm telling adults to stand on their own feet. You're putting Colin in a terrible position. Colin put himself there, I said, and felt a small tremor in my voice, not from anger, but from the tiredness of repeating facts to people who prefer the melody of their own excuses. He is capable of finding a solution. The company has assets. The bank has options. If this week goes hard, that doesn't make my boundary less correct. She took a breath you could hear. If you had concerns, you could have come to me. I did, I said. For years. There was a silence then. And in it I could hear her kitchen, soup simmering. A clock with a loud tick. The hollow sound of a spoon put down too firmly on a counter. When she spoke again, it was with that chilly civility she saves for funerals and fundraisers. You will regret this when the town does. I don't think so, I said. Goodbye, Judith. I hung up and put the phone in the drawer with the measuring spoons because sometimes you have to put a thing where you cannot hear it breathe. The next day, day 2 of 7, the bank sent an email confirming the notice had been delivered and acknowledged. The plant's accountant requested a meeting with their lender. I pictured the conversation, measured, full of conditional verbs, a spreadsheet on a screen and a lot of fumbling between terms ordinary people use and the terms bankers prefer. I have sat in enough of those rooms to know the choreography. It is not glamorous. It is simply the work of seeing numbers for what they are, not what you wish they could be. Around town, the story began to shift in the way stories do when facts begin to show their faces. A few people who had nodded along with Judith in rooms where my name was tidy to remove now said, at the post office or in the store aisle, that they hadn't meant for things to become ugly. They didn't say ugly had started long before my letter. It's a rare person who looks that far back in their own footprints. Louise sat with me in the cafe by the pharmacy, and we ate muffins that had more loyalty to sugar than to fruit. She asked what she could do. I told her the truth. Keep your head. Tell the story straight if someone asks. And don't let anyone make this about a woman being difficult when it is about a woman being exact. On day 3, I sorted my binders at home. The act of putting papers in order is a way to keep your heart from running ahead of your feet. I found a thank you card Jonah wrote me when he was 8 for fixing the strap on my mask even though you worked last night. I found a raffle ticket stub from a year when we sold 1.200 tickets for new dasher boards and only broke even because the contractor found rot we hadn't budgeted for. I found a note I'd written to myself after a meeting long ago. Say no to being the contingency plan. I had said yes anyway. Funny how much of a life is in the margins of lists. As the week unfurled, the counter-pressure rose. Judith leaned on the other committee members to keep the recognition ceremony intact. As if holding the ribbon tighter would keep the frame from shifting. She told people I was unstable. Someone started a rumor that I had mismanaged the fundraisers when I was treasurer 2 years back. Which would have been laughable if it didn't stick to anyone who has ever touched a cash box. I did not chase the rumor down. I called Patel and asked him to send the audit request a second time. By email in addition to courier. Addressed to each committee member individually. Copy them all, I said. No one can claim they didn't see the questions. On day 4, a man I barely knew stopped me by the bulletin board at the grocery and told me he admired what I was doing. It's high time someone reminded people who pays what around here, he said, nodding as if he were in a bar telling a joke. I told him he had misunderstood. I was not proving a point about money. I was drawing a line around my name. He looked confused and then embarrassed. As if he'd complimented me wrong. On day 5, the plant's bookkeeper corrected the invoice schedule one had circled. And a payment landed that made their graph less ugly. A small victory. They asked the bank to consider the additional incoming cash as part of their request. The bank agreed to reassess after day 7. Colin texted me that he was working on it. I wrote back that I knew he was. There are fights you don't need to have because the outcome will announce itself without your commentary. That evening, I walked to the rink and watched Jonah in net. Rebound drill. As promised. The coach shot low on the pads. Jonah absorbed and directed, the way he's been taught, into corners. Away from traffic. In the stands. 2 dads argued about the Mooseheads and whether their goalie prospects were worth scouting. I sat with my hands in my pockets. My breath making small puffs in the cold. Elise, the gossip said, had overreacted. Elise had made a power play. Elise had been told she wasn't welcome and had taken her toys and gone home. People like tidy stories. They put a bow on mess that refuses bows. Watching my son track the puck. Square to the shooter. I thought about angle and economy. You don't reach for a shot you can smother. You don't sprawl if legs will do. You do the exact amount required to keep the puck in front of you where you can see it. I suppose that's all I was trying to do. On day 6, the committee finally replied to Patel's letter. A curt email, 3 sentences, promising to gather documents by the end of the month and noting that volunteers were not accountants. As if asking for receipts were a blood sport. Patel forwarded it with a brief note, progress. He also sent a draft of a press notice for the foundation administering the scholarship funds, nothing flashy. Just a transparent line on a website that listed donors as community contributors and explained the conditions under which the money would be awarded. A picture of a rink with no people in it accompanied the text. I liked that. The rink looked itself without the pressure to smile. That afternoon, Jonah found me in the kitchen folding dish towels the way my mother taught me. Thirds then half. He leaned against the counter with the easy fatigue of a boy who has burned off what a day gave him to burn. Coach said I was calm today. He said. I didn't feel calm, but that's what he said. Sometimes calm is just what your body looks like when your brain is busy. I said. He nodded. People are talking, he added, eyes on his socks. They always are. I said. What are they saying? That you're mad at the Lawrence. He glanced up at me. Searching. I am not mad. I said. I am accurate. There's a difference. He absorbed that. Coach says a clean pad save is accurate. He offered. Not flashy, but it wins games. Your coach is smarter than he looks. I said. And he grinned. We didn't speak of it further. There is only so much grown-up logic a child should have to hold. I made him hot chocolate and watched the steam carry its small sweetness upward. And I thought about all the invisible kindnesses that pass through kitchens like this one every day. No plaque records them, no slideshow. They are their own record. In a child's steady gaze. In a house that feels safe at bedtime. Day 7 dawned clear and brittle. The rain had washed the salt into the ditches and left the roads dark as wet slate. I woke before the alarm and lay still, counting the clicks of the baseboard heaters as they negotiated with the morning. When the phone rang at 9:15, I knew whose number would be on the screen before I looked. Grant James from the bank. He told me, with a voice that tried and failed to be neutral, that the plant had not secured a substitute guarantor and would not meet the bank's risk criteria without it. The line would be frozen until remedied. He said the words with care, as if he were setting down a heavy thing on a fragile table. Thank you, I said. That's clear. Ms. Moran, he added, this will cause complications. I understand, I said. It will also cause clarity. Perhaps that's overdue. When we hung up, I stood at the window and watched a gull hop along the porch rail. Pivot serious as a banker. A pickup rolled past, exhaust blooming in the cold. Across the way, Mrs. Doyle salted her steps in a methodical square pattern she's used since before I moved here. The town did what it always does. And yet, in the middle of routine, a beam had shifted. You could feel it if you were the kind of person who notices which doors stick when the weather changes. Around noon, an email arrived from the Fall Fair Committee with a list of program updates. Buried in the third paragraph, after mention of a pie contest and the number of volunteers needed for parking duty, was a line, due to unforeseen scheduling considerations. The rink patron recognition will be announced at a later date. No apology, no explanation, just the soft retreat of a plan that could not stand upright. I read the sentence twice and put my phone face down on the table. Somewhere, Judith would be reworking her smile. I laced my boots and walked to the mailbox with letters of my own, a thank you to the Foundation for quick work. A note to Maureen enclosing a copy of the defibrillator warranty in case anyone came asking. At the corner, I ran into Gary from the hardware store. He lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel and rolled down his window. In towns like ours, that counts as laying your heart bare. Lot of movement this week. He said, movement is good for a body. I answered, prevents stiffness. He laughed. Genuine, and shook his head. You've got nerve. No, I said, I've got paperwork. That evening, when Jonah was at practice, I went through the house with a cloth and a bucket, wiping baseboards and the tops of doors. It's a thing I do when I'm turning a page. The rag came away gray and honest. I emptied the bucket into the slop sink in the basement and listened to the water gurgle in the pipes. On the workbench lay the glove I had mended. The stitches held. They weren't pretty, if you were the kind of person who judges quilts at fairs. They were sturdy. I'll take sturdy. Later, when the house was quiet and the lamp drew a soft circle on the table, I sat with my ledger and drew a line under the week. Not a flourish, just a line. I wrote the date. I listed what I had done, notified the bank, amended the will, requested an audit, closed loops at the rink. I listed, beside that, what I had not done, called the local paper, posted on Facebook, named names from my porch. There is a discipline in letting paperwork do the talking. It says, "This is not a feud. This is housekeeping." At the bottom of the page, I wrote one sentence: "Boundaries are not punishments, they are maps." Then I closed the book. Outside, a wind came up. It rattled the downspout and made the porch light flicker once. Somewhere closer to the water, a foghorn sounded its low, certain note. I thought about the fair coming. All those pies and hay bales and children with their winter hats pulled low. I thought about the rink. Its ice kissed smooth. Its fresh netting taut. I thought about a ceremony postponed. About people who would tell themselves a story that made them feel better and people who would not be fooled by the neatness of that story, even if they did not say so aloud. I thought about what happens when you pull a brace and the frame shivers and then either holds or does not. I thought about how the real story sometimes only begins when the speeches get cancelled. I rinsed my mug, turned off the lamp, and stood for a moment in the dark kitchen, letting my eyes make out the old shapes of the room, the fridge with its dent from a move 15 years ago, the stove that runs hot on the left burner, the table with a scratch you can only see when the light hits just so. Houses, like people, collect their own honest record. As I climbed the stairs, I felt that quiet tired I trust, the kind that doesn't ask for a medal. In Jonah's room, his breath was even. I put my hand briefly on the doorframe, the way I always do, to say a wordless thank you to whatever keeps the ordinary intact. Tomorrow, there will be more phone calls. There will be hairline cracks in plans that looked solid last week. There will be a town getting ready for a fair, with more work than hands and more opinions than tents. There will be, I suspect, a meeting in a back office where a woman says to a man that it might be wise to delay a certain plaque until after certain lines are sorted. And the man will nod because he knows what a bank notice means even if he doesn't say so out loud. There will be a boy in net who squares to the shooter and absorbs the first shot without flourish, directing the rebound where it can do the least harm. And there will be, waiting on my desk, a small stack of papers that changed a week without raising their voices. If the story wants a villain, it will have to keep looking. All I have is a list, a pen, and a decision to stop being the brace no one wanted to admit they leaned on. The rest will happen where all real changes happen, in towns like ours, in kitchens, in offices with glass walls, in parking lots where people speak more truth with their eyebrows than their mouths, on the cold edge of a rink where you can hear what wood sounds like when weight shifts. You listen for it if you're careful. It's the sound of a thing learning its own strength. And if, on the day of the fair, there are fewer speeches and more gaps where names ought to be, well, a body can see a gap as an insult or an invitation. You can stuff it with the nearest loud answer, or you can leave it open long enough for a truer answer to walk through. I have done my part. I have left the space. The next move belongs to people who say they love this town. We will hear how they mean it when the music starts and the lights come up and the bills come due. Some endings arrive like thunder. Ours came like weather you could smell the night before, the fall fair weekend. Damp and bright in turns. The kind of cold that gets into your sleeves if you don't mind the cuffs. By Friday afternoon, the field beside the community center had been carved into lanes for parking. Boys in reflective vests waved cars toward the hay stubble. A line formed at the fry truck. You could hear the oil talking a steady language over the hum of the generator. I stood with my hands inside my coat, watching Jonah skate warm-up laps under lights borrowed from the volunteer fire department. The rink looked temporarily grand, edges softened by bunting, but it was the same old ice, one panel at the far corner that never froze quite right. The nick in the board from a winter the Zamboni chain snapped and left a mark no one thought worth buffing out. The ordinary always shows itself if you look long enough. The announcements had been revised in a way that tried hard not to look like retreat. There would be no unveiling of lifetime patrons. No plaques. No speeches from the stage. There would be music, pies, a scavenger hunt, and a puck drop by a retired player with a smile that hadn't seen a dental plan in a while. The schedule taped to the door had a blank space where the recognition slot had been. Someone had written in blue pen, "Kids Race." I liked that. It's hard to hold a grudge while watching 6-year-olds run with their mittens flopping like small flags. The plant's pickup trucks were there in the lot. The familiar dents making a low skyline of practical trouble. Word had spread that the line of credit was frozen. I heard it in the way men kept their voices level when they asked each other about next week. I heard it in the way women counted change for coffee twice. It wasn't panic. Panic is loud. This was quiet arithmetic. People were figuring out where the shock would land. I had done my own math carefully. The timing would hurt. There is no clean time to move a brace, but the numbers said the company could fix their balance if they made 2 hard calls and sold a non-essential piece of equipment they had been hanging onto because someday might need it. Someday had come. Judith arrived with a scarf tied like a promise and a smile in the shape of command. She is good at public. She has trained herself to keep her shoulders square even when weather changes. Colin came behind her, not quite in step, the way men do when they are borrowing dignity from a coat they don't own. He nodded at me, a careful nod you could interpret more than one way. He is trying, I told myself, and then let the thought go before it turned into a prayer. Maureen, the teacher, handled the microphone with the tidy competence of a woman who can get 30 children to stand still long enough to hear a rule. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked volunteers until the word thank became a rhythm and then a background hum. She reminded us about the bake sale, the fundraiser for new helmets, the rules about not climbing the boards. She did not say why the recognition was missing. Rooms don't always need the postmortem stated aloud to know which patient didn't survive. Halfway through the afternoon, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. Patel's name on the screen. I stepped away from the light spill toward the shadow under the bleachers and answered. The committee sent the first batch of documents. He said without preamble. Partial, sloppy, enough to see the outline. Whoever kept the ledger made a habit of describing some expenses as hospitality, when they should have been itemized. It may be ignorance. It may be convenience. Either way, the auditor will flag it. I don't want a circus. I said. You won't get one from me. He answered. But I'm also not going to let them pretend a shrug is a receipt. What happens next? They'll send more. Or they won't. He said. The report will say exactly what can be proven. Facts are not temperamental. Ms. Moran. People are. He promised a written update Monday. I thanked him and put the phone away. The frost under the bleachers had its own small sparkle where the light slanted in. People think of lawyers as men in fancy offices. But this one keeps our town's spine straight from a room that smells like peppermint and paper. It is good, sometimes, to know which parts of a story are boring. Boring is what gets people through winters. When I came back into the rink, Jonah was in net, legs like small barn doors, glove hand alive. The scrimmage had turned friendly serious, the way games at fairs do when pride is the prize and the ice isn't quite level. He tracked the puck with the patient attention I recognize in him when he's building Lego or reading box scores. A shot went low glove side, and he smothered it without drama. I felt the clean satisfaction of watching a child use a good habit. You cannot buy that feeling. You earn it one small repetition at a time. Near the gate, Judith's voice rose and fell. A radio said a little too loud in a kitchen. She was telling someone how unfortunate it was that bad optics had distracted from a celebration of community. I stood at the corner of the boards and listened to the scrape of blades. I have learned to let people narrate their own movies if it keeps them from reaching for the props. Her words slid off the ice and pooled under the bleachers where words go to stiffen. The first public sign that something had changed came in the form of a clipboard. The bank had sent a junior officer, someone with a polite tie and the posture of a man sent to do a job he'd prefer not to do in front of neighbors. He waited until between songs and then asked politely for Colin. They disappeared into the glassed in office wear. Normally, lost mittens are reunited with their people. 2 men followed, one with a plant jacket and one I didn't recognize. Likely a supplier. No one shouted. They didn't need to. The door closed, and bodies gathered instinctively as if warmth could be shared through glass. I did not go closer. I do not like to watch humiliation the way some do. It doesn't teach me anything I didn't already know about gravity. A few minutes later, Colin emerged with his face arranged into a version of calm that fooled strangers and no one else. He nodded to the supplier, who nodded back in the way that means I heard you. Not I accept. Judith's mouth set in that hard line she gets when her plans meet an immovable object. She lifted her chin, then lowered it when she noticed people watching. Maureen, dear, practical Maureen, stepped to the mic and got the music going again. If you've ever seen a woman set a table faster when company arrives early, you've seen that exact motion. Word moved through the crowd in the soft way words do when they are carried by eyes. The plant would need to hold a shipment at the dock until Monday. The bank had asked for updated numbers. The fall in the exchange rate last month meant less cushion. Nothing was on fire. But no one should be smoking near the barn. Things you cannot say to a room you say anyway. If you know how. Jonah's game ended. He came off the ice, pink-cheeked, and in that small window where children belong wholly to themselves, before critics come with clipboards, he grinned at me through his cage. Did you see the stack? I saw it. I said. It was clean. He nodded like a craftsman. Felt clean. We shared a hot chocolate that burned the tongue and came with a marshmallow that stuck to his upper lip until he licked it off without noticing. For a moment, it was only that, a mother and a son and a styrofoam cup that will live 200 years longer than anyone here. I put my glove on his head and felt the sweat damp through his hair. He leaned in but pretended he didn't. Children are contract lawyers for dignity. By late afternoon, the fog had slid in from the water. Not dramatic, just a steady softening of the edges. The music took on that echo you get when sound has to push through thicker air. The fair did what fairs do in fog. Lights looked kinder. Conversations moved closer. The fry truck's heat felt more like something you might remember come February. The program MC announced the puck drop was moving up by 20 minutes because of weather, and the old player made his way to center ice in a jacket that had belonged to a younger man. He bent stiffly to touch the puck to the ice. The crowd clapped the way small towns clap for age and for effort. Which is to say, sincerely. Then something no one could plan. The generator that fed the extra lights coughed and quit. For one beat, the rink went dark except for the exit signs and the strip of emergency lighting. There was a small sound from the crowd, not fear. Not yet. The kind of sound people make when their story meets a pause. Then, almost at once, phones lit up. The rink reflected 100 screens. The Zamboni driver, who was also the volunteer electrician, jogged to the generator and did whatever men with useful hands do in such moments. It started again, voice rough but willing. The lights warmed back, one by one. People applauded like you do when the ordinary resumes. The MC cracked a joke. The band struck up another song. And the rink exhaled, one body sharing breath. I tell you that because it is the only moment that could be called dramatic. And even then it was only a generator and a man who knows his machines. That's the story I prefer, competence under light that doesn't flatter. No villain. Just a wire you forgot was old. It would be tidy to say that an announcement came next. That someone took a microphone and confessed to bad bookkeeping. Poor judgment. Pride. Life is stingy with scenes that align so cleanly with need. What came instead were short, separate conversations that changed the town more than any speech, in the office. The bank's man explaining line by line what a freeze means, near the fry truck. A supplier saying he'd hold his invoice if the plant would put in writing the date he could expect a check, at the end of the bleachers. 2 committee members asking Maureen whether her conscience could stand a list that cut out the woman who had taped their children's knees. None of those exchanges would make a highlight reel. All of them moved something from one side of the scale to the other. When the pie auction began, people bid a little higher than they meant to. Maybe that's because we are, despite ourselves, kind when given an excuse that doesn't embarrass us. Jonah tugged my sleeve and nodded toward the stage. He wanted a specific lemon meringue. The kind with a crust like old paper and a lemon that tastes like childhood. We didn't get it. Gary from the hardware store outbid us and then sent the pie to the fire station because they'd been called out during dessert last week. He looked over at me and shrugged. Embarrassed by his goodness, I smiled back and felt some small knot loosen in my chest. As night came on, I knew the time had arrived for me to do the only public thing I had planned. Not a speech, not a confrontation, a correction. I walked to Maureen at the mic between songs and asked if I might have 1 minute to read a note into the record. She looked into my face the way good teachers do when they are measuring risk. She nodded. I took the microphone and heard my voice across the speakers in that flattened way microphones have. It removes the quaver and makes everything sound more certain than it is. Good evening, I said. Elise Morin. I want to put something on the record while we are all gathered here. Much has been said this week, some of it to me. Some of it about me. I want to correct what I can. And then I will take up no more space than a person ought to at a community event. A ripple. Enough attention to count. Not enough to give anyone ideas. I withdrew a personal financial guarantee from the plant. I said, I did this through proper notice to the bank. After years of providing that support. It is my right to do so. I did not do it to harm anyone's paycheck. I did it because adults should carry their own weight. And because accountability works better in sunlight. I have asked for an independent review of certain rink expenses. That review is not a witch hunt. It is a practice of good housekeeping. If the books are clean, that will be said in a letter longer than any rumor. If the books are messy, better we clean them before company comes. A quiet gathered, not the hush of awe. Just the useful kind that lets words land. I will be at the clinic and the rink and the grocery store same as always. I said, I am not leaving. I am not refusing to help when help is needed. I am saying, gently and firmly, that my name, my work, and my child will not be used to decorate anyone's story who would erase us when it suits. Thank you to those who asked me directly what happened instead of guessing. Thank you to the women who sent casseroles without cards. Thank you to the man who fixed the generator in the dark without asking permission. That is community. You don't need a plaque to do it. I handed the microphone back. There was no grand applause. But there were nods. And there were 2 hands on my elbow as I stepped through the crowd, one from Louise. Another from a man I only know as the Zamboni driver. You can build a life on those small grips. They don't slide when the floor is wet. The next morning, the fair resumed under a sky the color of a bruise healing. The plant announced a temporary slowdown, pending financial adjustments. If you lived in a city, you'd call it spin. Here, we call it Sunday. Colin spent most of the day on the phone. Judith moved like a general on a horse that has learned her gait. She didn't look at me. That's fine. There are conversations that can only happen after a person no longer needs to be the loudest version of themselves. On Monday, Patel sent the first page of the auditor's note. Preliminary findings indicate inadequate documentation for hospitality expenses totaling $4.812.17 over a 10-month period. It read, "No evidence of fraud, evidence of poor controls." A sentence that is both blessing and indictment to anyone who has ever kept books with a pencil changed outrage into a list. Lists are my home ground. The committee would need to answer. With receipts. With amended practices. With the kind of apology you can cash because it comes with a changed form at the bottom of the agenda. I felt tired in the way you feel after a long drive when every mile was necessary. Through the week, small consequences added up to the sum we had all expected. The plant sold the old forklift they'd been saving for parts. They negotiated a brief extension with the bank based on a tightened inventory plan. A supplier agreed to credit terms that would allow the next shipment to go out on Thursday if 2 invoices were paid by Wednesday at 3. It wasn't pretty, but it held. Those who wanted collapse did not get their drama. Those who feared ruin did not get their prophecy. We all got a town that creaked while it righted itself. And Judith? She held her line longer than was useful. Then she showed up at Maureen's classroom after school with a box of receipts and a mouth set so hard it might crack. She didn't apologize to me, she is not built for that kind of work. She said, loudly enough for the custodian to hear, that, of course, the books would be made right. And then she took a day off to file paper under the unflattering light of a staff room. That will never make a slideshow. Good. Slideshows make poor scriptures. The week after, the committee posted, in 12-point font on the town website, a paragraph, in the interest of transparency. The Fall Fair Committee has engaged a third-party review of expenses related to rink improvements. We thank community members for their continued support and patience. No names. No flourishes. It was enough. I printed it and taped it inside the pantry door where I keep the recipe for pie crust and the measurement chart that tells me how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon, even though I should know by now. It's good to keep in one place the things that restore proportion. If you're waiting for a scene where Judith and I sit at a table and say what we really think, I can't give it to you. The truth is less dramatic and truer. We crossed paths at the pharmacy. She looked at me and chose to ask about Jonah's grades. I answered. Then I asked whether she'd like a copy of the Foundation's public report when it posted. She said she'd appreciate that. We both nodded. The path through a room widened by half a foot. People write sonnets about less. What do I make of it? In the end, That kindness without boundaries is a kind of theft. And boundaries without kindness are a kind of desert. That a town is not the sum of its speeches, but the way it hands a man a wrench when the light goes out. That people will tell you who they are with their first reaction to being told no. That you can withdraw support without spite. And that doing so doesn't make you cold, it makes you honest. That my son will skate better for having seen his mother stand in place while weather tried to push her over. I have heard it said that revenge is a dish served cold. The older I get, the more I think revenge is a word we use when a person declines to be furniture. I did not ruin anyone. I refused to be leaned on after being told I made the room untidy. If that feels like ruin to someone, then perhaps they have built their house with too few beams that are theirs to claim. I will not carry the shame they offer me because I have learned. In hospital rooms at 3 in the morning, that shame is a poor ventilator. It moves air but not oxygen. I could end here with a benediction. But I am not a minister. I am a woman with a steady hand. A child who needs breakfast. And a town that, for all its small cruelties, is the only one I want to stand in line behind at the post office. When the rink needs a mop pushed, I will push. When the committee needs minutes checked, I will read slowly and with a pencil. When my name is needed to guarantee a thing that should stand on its own, I will keep my pen capped. After the fair, I hung my coat by the door and set my boots to dry. Jonah dropped his gear in the corner where gear goes and stood a moment in the kitchen doorway, watching me wipe the table the way I always do. Circles wide then small. Did we win? He asked, meaning something larger than the scrimmage. We held, I said. For now, that's enough. He nodded, satisfied in the way of a boy who understands structure even when he can't yet name every beam. He reached for an apple, took a bite, and told me a joke his friend had told him that made no sense and everything at once. Later, after he slept, I wrote a note and slid it into the folder with my will. If someone needs to know why, tell them, because the work matters more than the banner. It is the only legacy I can promise that will outlast the paint. The ocean outside our town hasn't changed because we learned to count receipts. It still moves in and out without apology. We don't change tides. We change ourselves so that, when they go out, we aren't found standing in places we should have left long ago. If this story makes anyone think twice before asking a woman to be quiet as the condition of being needed, then it has done enough work. If it makes one committee member somewhere write the word receipt on a line where he once wrote entertainment, then that's a victory large enough to lend to Monday. If you've listened this far, maybe you've stood in a kitchen with your hands on the back of a chair and known you had to choose. Not between good and evil, but between being accurate and being liked. If so, I hope you chose accuracy. People will come around, or they won't. Your house will still stand. The lights will still come on when the generator coughs and you put your shoulder to the rope. I won't tell you our town is fixed. It isn't. Nothing that holds humans is. We will make new mistakes by Christmas and different ones in spring. I don't expect Judith to bring me a pie or for Colin to buy a suit that fits contrition. I expect this, that the next time a list is made, someone will ask whether the person who tied the knots has a name. That the next time a bank letter sits on a desk, a man will read the clause about notice and understand that courtesy is not weakness. That the next time a boy stands in net with his knees soft and his eyes up, he will know his mother chose a line and kept it. That's enough. For a winter, for a woman, for a town that wants to think well of itself and sometimes needs a little help from the truth. I will be here when the ice goes out and the boats need their lines checked. I will be here when the school asks for cupcakes and when the clinic needs someone to watch the waiting room while the nurse runs late. I will be here when the list is made again. Reading it, not for my name, but for the holes where someone's name should be and wasn't. We will learn. Slowly. The good things always take their time. If this story found you somewhere between saying yes and saying enough, I hope it gave you permission to draw your map. To choose which beams you'll hold. And which ones you'll step away from. To mean it when you say welcome. And to mean it just as much when you say no. If you think that's revenge, I won't try to talk you out of the word. I'll just keep my hands on the work and the rope. Because the ocean doesn't mind what we call it. It minds whether we keep the boats afloat.